Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture of our spring lecture series. It's with great pleasure that I'm able to welcome back Joel Sanders to CCA and introduce him this evening. Joel is a professor of architecture at Yale University, and he's also the principal of Joel Sanders Architect, an innovative and provocative architectural firm that's located in New York City. Joel's practice has received numerous design awards, including 8 AIA awards and an Interior Design Magazine Best of the Year award. The work of JSA has been exhibited in many international venues and institutions, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Cooper Hewitt and Vitra Design Museums, and is also part of the permanent collections of the MoMA in New York City, the SF MoMA, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. And their work has been published in many different architectural publications, magazines, Architectural Record, New York Times, A+U, and others. Tonight's lecture, as you can see and as we had advertised, is going to focus specifically on Joel's new book called Groundwork Between Landscape and Architecture that he co-authored with landscape architect Diana Belmori. Groundwork focuses on the new reciprocity between architecture and landscape and the ways in which the traditional distinctions between these disciplinary domains have been transformed in recent practice and replaced with a new, more integrated and symbiotic form of practice. The book that Joel will present this evening includes projects such as the Cairo Expo City project in Egypt by Zaha Hadid, Toyo Ito's City Central Park in Japan, Howler and Yoon's EcoPod project in Boston, and Belmori and Sanders' own proposal for the New York City Olympic Equestrian Facility. And in the book, they examine 25 projects through the concepts of topography, ecology, and biocomputation. Each of these represents a hybrid form of practice and a new kind of synthesis that crosses the divide between nature and culture. In addition to his new book, Groundwork, Joel is also the editor of Stud, Architecture of Masculinity, published by Princeton Architectural Press in 1996. And he's also the author of Joel Sanders' Writings and Projects, published by Monticelli Press in 2005. I'm very happy that Joel is back with us at CCA this evening. Please join me in welcoming Joel Sanders.
Thank you very much, and many thanks to you, Isla, for inviting me yet back again to one of my favorite cities, San Francisco, and one of my favorite schools, the CCA, and one of my all-time favorite colleagues, which is Isla Berman, who, as you all know, is one of the most lovable, smartest, and most charismatic women in architecture, and you're very lucky to have her. So anyway, the light is like right in my eyes, but I guess we can't change that. But anyway, so just a little. That's perfect, perfect, great. Okay, so just in terms of the format, I'm going to be talking about this book that I co-edited, Groundwork, and the format will be, I'm going to spend the first kind of 15 minutes giving you a little bit of a kind of preface to the kind of, let's say, the mantra of the book, and then I'm going to show you a selection of projects from the book, and then I'm going to show about 5 projects of my own work. So, and hopefully it should be about an hour. Okay. So Groundwork is not another book that romanticizes nature and bids architects to consult the genius of place. Instead, it's an urgent appeal for designers to pursue a new approach that overcomes the false dichotomy between architecture and landscape. And our interest in the union of these two disciplines, when I say we, I'm talking about Diana Belmori and myself, is in part motivated by the same urgent ecological concerns that we share with many of our colleagues. An integrated practice of landscape and architecture can have dramatic environmental consequences. The ecological role of each discipline is no longer a separate agenda, but allows buildings and landscapes to begin to perform form as integrated, interactive systems with the potential to heal the environment. But what excites us most about the prospect of an integrated practice is that it promises to be a catalyst for creativity. For too long, buildings in the West have, with rare exceptions, been conceived of as isolated objects that float in semi-naturalistic landscapes. Considering buildings and landscapes as reciprocal entities, we believe can instigate the invention of an innovative, robust landscape architecture design vocabulary that overcomes this long-standing dichotomy and can tap into the consequences of the formal and programmatic potential of sustainable design principles. So the overall objective of Groundwork is basically to promote a new inventive mode of interdisciplinary practice. And the thought is that I want to talk to you about in the first, let's say, 10, 15 minutes, is that we think that it can only be achieved by first sort of understanding how we came to and how we can transcend the kind of deep-rooted cultural, ideological, and disciplinary prejudices that I think have brought us to a place today where the two disciplines, although getting closer, are still separate. So in the introduction to the book, I wrote an essay that examines what I call the landscape architectural divide from a cultural and historical perspective. And my argument, which I'll condense, is that this split can be traced to yet another deep-seated, yet equally suspect Western polarity that opposes humans and nature, and as a consequence, buildings and landscapes. And so while these attitudes date back to antiquity, one version of this dualism finds its home in an influential body of thought that emerged in 19th century America that scholars refer to as wilderness. And wilderness was bolstered by a whole constellation of overlapping cultural discourses, philosophy, literature, and even notions of gender and sexuality, which I'll touch on in the next few minutes. Relying on the long-standing personification of nature as woman, feminist critics like Carolyn Merchant have shown that the rhetoric underlying the expansion and settlement of the American continent was founded upon biblical accounts of the expulsion from Eden, the fall, as we know, brought about by a woman. And wilderness in the Bible and subsequently was depicted as often as an unruly female that needed to be subdued and ultimately cultivated through the labor of who but through men. And the goal was to recover paradise lost on earth. And for many feminists, this conception of Mother Earth as a passive female subjected to kind of male domination and exploitation through the agency of technology persists today. But now we're back to the mid-19th century in America. The American frontier had been settled at this time, and a first generation of environmentalist thinkers, people like Henry David Thoreau, Charles Muir, and Theodore Roosevelt, were confronted with an intimidating dilemma that in many ways is not that different to what we face today. And that was the disappearance of wilderness. And interestingly enough, scholars have pointed out that this change, this confrontation of the disappearance of wilderness, resulted in a radical shift in wilderness thinking. For men like Theodore Roosevelt, who we know championed the first national parks, he believed, and others like him, that the wilderness, the American West, was the home of the frontiersman, of the cowboy, and represented a haven that sustained what he, and I'm quoting him, vigorous masculinity, manliness. And for people like Roosevelt, nature literally represented a refuge where robust men could resist what they believed was the emasculating, domesticating forces of the rising, rapid urban culture. And so for these authors, for people like Roosevelt, nature was now recast as a different kind of female, now a virgin, in desperate need of male guardianship that needed to be, for the first time, not cultivated, but conserved and protected from the ravages of industrial civilization, and by whom? By red-blooded American males. And not only did wilderness thinking give birth to the American environmentalist movement, which is important and comes down to us today, but in the book, I try to argue that this wilderness way of thinking, this mentality, also shaped the evolution of landscape architectural practice in America from the 19th century up until this time. My point is that its dualistic conception of people and nature only reinforced this age-old Western conception of the building as a man-made artifact, qualitatively different from its natural surroundings. And by the way, I think this is a particularly American way of conceptualizing that relationship. And in turn, this way of thinking impacted professional practice, resulting in the professional segregation of architects from landscape architects into parallel professional organizations. And it's, I think, not a coincidence that in 1899, at the very height of the wilderness movement in America, a new professional academy, the American Society of Landscape Architects, the ASLA, was established. So we get this kind of emergence of these bifurcated disciplines for the first time. And what I find interesting is that I think wilderness core values not only produced or resulted in dual design professionals, but it also shaped design approaches. By positing that the human is entirely outside the natural, wilderness presents people, and in particular designers, with a fundamental paradox. How to reconcile the ideal of pristine, untouched nature with the imprint of human design. And I think that this sort of deep and persistent suspicion of designed nature that begins in the 19th century still, I think, comes down to us today. And so I want to give you sort of three examples, kind of from the greatest hits of landscape architecture from the 19th century to now. First, consider the pioneering work of Frederick Law Olmsted. We know the great founding father of American landscape architecture. Opposing city and nature, he conceived of projects like Central Park as a natural oasis inscribed within the fabric of a dense metropolis that for him specifically offered a refuge for the kind of alienated urban dweller, right, who escaped the city and escaped the industrial city to enjoy nature's rejuvenating effects, which for him, and he was very specific about this, was made possible through the visual contemplation of nature. Remember, people didn't go to play sports in parks, they strolled and they looked at nature. And for Olmsted, communion with nature was predicated on exposing people to a simulacrum of natural scenery, he said, that was unspoiled by any evidence of human intervention. Olmsted, we know, carefully composed topography and trees specifically to screen out the offending urban environment, which, of course, he lost that battle, and now that was clearly before tall buildings. But in projects like Central Park and later the Boston Riverway, Olmsted obscured not only the surrounding city, but all traces of human effort. The art and the technology that made the realization of these massive urban infrastructural projects possible. And he accomplished this by employing a naturalistic vocabulary that he inherited from the English that viewers then and now assumed to be natural. And my point is not to underestimate Olmsted's extraordinary achievement. I mean, he was, we know, phenomenal, right? But my point is rather to say that his legacy persists today, and that even today there's a kind of default identification of nature and this kind of picturesque style, which is, as we know, incredibly constructed, but people take to be natural. And I think it still today, designers disguise or mask the constructed nature of what they do with this default vocabulary, or often they do. So now I'm fast forwarding 40 years later, it's 1937, and this is renowned architectural historian Henry Russell Hitchcock. He curated an exhibition here in your city at what is today SF MoMA, an exhibition called Contemporary Landscape Architecture and Its Sources. And I discovered this. I wasn't aware of it. It's not that well known. Perhaps maybe people here know about it. But it was basically his response to the famed, international style exhibition at MoMA, and his attempt was to do for American architecture, or American landscape design, what he had done for architecture, which was basically to legitimate a new movement by bringing together a range of projects that exemplified the tenets of a new landscape style. And there's not time to talk about it, but at that time there was a lot of browbeating. There was a sense, well, we have this great modern architectural vocabulary, international style, but there was no such thing as the equivalent of a modern landscape approach. So Hitchcock transferred modern architecture's famed prohibition against ornament to a sister discipline, landscape, and he advocated that landscape designers renounce their inclination, and he uses this word over and over and over, to decorate residential properties for wealthy clients, which at that time, when in the 20s, was the kind of mainstay of the profession, gardening. And of course, this kind of prejudice against gardening taps into an even deeper prejudice that again considers gardening a kind of superficial pastime that's associated with housewives. And I don't have time again to go into it, but if you read the literature of landscape architecture, again and again, there's this pejorative association of landscaping with gardening, with women, and with domesticity. And so what Hitchcock championed, what he says is, he champions works, it's obvious, like Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy or Richard Neutra's Lovell House. He put them in the exhibition. And these buildings exemplify what some people refer to as the kind of machine in the garden, a kind of image of a kind of pristine sculptural machine building isolated in a kind of 18th century English garden, a pastoral setting, with the notion that nature is somehow deceptively unspoiled. And here again, undesigned or ostensibly undesigned nature is now conceived of as a spectacle framed through the modernist ribbon window, a conception again that I think we still have inherited today, this idea of the kind of cool building that sort of sits in this kind of naturalistic landscape. Okay, now 30 years later, it's the 60s, and I think there's a similar struggle to resolve what I'm trying to emphasize is the supposed incompatibility between nature and design. And this informed the very influential ecological design approach advanced by Ian McHarg, who was a charismatic UPenn professor, and he wrote this book, Design with Nature. And for many, this pioneering book is the kind of Bible of ecological design. And for McHarg, writing in the 60s, Olmsted's worst predictions had been realized. He said rapacious capitalists, aided by remarkable technological advances, had finally tipped the precarious balance between nature and civilization. And he believed it was the responsibility of not architects, but landscape architects to step in and to correct the resulting environmental casualties, which for him were the kind of degrading industrial American slums and cities. And echoing the sentiments of people like Hitchcock, McHarg also dismissed everything that his predecessors in the history of landscape architecture had to teach. It was all a bunch of sort of decorative, residential gardening. And instead he said that landscape designers must turn to nature, okay? He urged designers to emulate the form and structure of living things. And we know that McHarg pioneered a methodology that encouraged designers to consider a range of interconnected environmental factors, things like climate, water, flora, and fauna, a system which is still immensely influential today. But my point here, again, is not to denigrate McHarg, who's an amazing pioneer, but to say that I think one of the kind of offshoots of his way of thinking was a kind of comprehensive, what he did was he generated these very, very large-scale comprehensive proposals through a process-oriented approach that was grounded in what he said was the supposedly objective, inevitable logic of science. And I think as a consequence of that, he largely evaded, in many ways, design. His master plans were too large, too conceptual, too abstract, to engage, I think, issues of sort of form and materiality and of space and of the human body that the work of some of his predecessors did. So just to sum up this piece, I pick Olmsted and Hitchcock and McHarg as but three examples of what I think are 3 examples of influential practitioners whose design philosophy was shaped, and I think in many ways was constrained by wilderness-inflected themes, inherited values that I think continue to shape landscape practice today. And so I hate when people do this in PowerPoint presentations, but I'm going to, okay, just to kind of reiterate the points. First, what are they? A dualistic way of thinking that views nature as a passive, vulnerable entity that must be protected from the predatory interests of humans, including architects and landscape architects. 2, a professional bias against designed nature, which again is dismissed as a frivolous pursuit associated with residential gardening, decoration, and feminine artifice. And lastly, a preference for large-scale problem solving, which is not to say that large-scale problem solving isn't important, but I think it often leads to a kind of deterministic design approach which uncritically sort of embraces science alone. And so what Diane and I are arguing in this, in this book is a new way of thinking, a new way of working. Designers must radically readjust the way they're conceiving. They need to, first and foremost, we think, call into question the wilderness values, the unexamined foundation that I think in many ways still shapes the perception of what it means for people to live with nature. We must call this into question. Relinquishing wilderness values, I think, will allow designers to adopt the more complicated viewpoint advanced by progressive scholars and scientists, a recognition that nature and civilization, although not the same, have always been intertwined and are becoming more so. Climate change reveals that there's not a square inch of our planet that does not in some way bear the imprint of humans. Landscape and culture intermix in various combinations. While constructed elements seem to predominate in metropolitan areas and natural elements in rural zones, we know that organic and synthetic operate as a gradient, as a continuous gradient of differing intensities that forms a continuum across the surface of the Earth. And so since 2000, we think a new way of thinking, a new way of working has been gaining momentum. And our book, Groundwork, attempts to map this trend by assembling in one volume the work of a wide range of international practitioners, some known, some less well known. They're all creating provocative projects that register this more nuanced understanding of the complex interplay between humans, nature, and technology. And while the various perspectives of these designers are different, they're not part of a kind of self-proclaimed movement, we brought them together in this book because we think they all share a common interest in dissolving traditional distinctions between buildings and environments. And so Groundwork identifies 3 design directions that unite this otherwise heterogeneous group. The 3 are topography, ecology, and biocomputation. They're overlapping categories. Some have already responded by saying that they're arbitrary. You can tell me if you agree. But the point is, let me at least show you 2 or 3 examples from each category just to give you a sense of these differing but related design approaches. The first, topography. Topographic designers reject the paradigm of what I showed at the beginning, the particularly American ideal of the object building that sits discretely in an isolated way on the land. Instead, topographers manipulate the ground to blend building and landscape, treating built form as inhabitable landform. And a group of topographers included in Groundwork, including Toyo Ito and Zaha Hadid, confront an increasingly common challenge, which is to design the kind of flat marginal sites on the outskirts of cities. And they respond similarly. They employ a kind of sinuous vocabulary to transform featureless properly into constructed landforms with striking silhouettes that confuse traditional distinctions between man-made and natural. And Ito and Hadid, again, adopt these curvilinear geometries and also in an interesting way, mix hard and softscape together to produce these sort of striking topographic forms. And again, I just want to emphasize that, again, no longer resorting to, again, that sort of default kind of naturalistic vocabulary, which has become a kind of international style, or had up until recently. Another project on a hill, no, actually in contrast to these sort of flat projects, there are other projects in Groundworks, quite a few, that are intervening in sloping sites. One is this competition-winning design by Duncan Lewis Scape Architects. It's a school, the Lycée Moulin, and as you can see here, classroom circulation and public gathering spaces of the school are all combined under this immense canopy made up of these sort of horizontal ribbons that are planted. And as you can see, the kind of clerestory glazing, again, allows people within the school to see out. And we were kind of interested in the way this project hovers between a kind of camouflage and a kind of sort of striking kind of design on the landscape. In my understanding, it's going to be built. Another project by Snow Hedda takes a very different approach to intervening in a hillside. In this case, it's not about kind of alighting that distinction, but making a clear distinction between building and hillside. This is the Peter Dass Museum. It's located in a coastal town in Norway, and here Snow Hedda cut this deep trench into a raised mound that slopes towards the sea, and then they fill this void with the museum space, and the building's slender form is capped by this arch roof, which again mirrors in a very abstract way the kind of contours of the surrounding topography. And we like this building because a lot of people say, oh, all your buildings are, you know, it's all about just sort of built, you know, blended buildings, but not at all. And I think what is interesting, that at the same time as Snow Hedda absolutely maintains this distinction between building and landscape, they constantly call that into question or ask the viewer to do so. And then particularly, as you can see, there are these kind of highly reflective side walls that produce this sort of superimposition through reflection of, again, the man-made and the natural, asking you to call that dichotomy into question. The next category of the book is ecology and sustainable design. I think, as many of you know in the audience, is important, but it tends to be a product-oriented way of thinking. It tends to evaluate materials and techniques on the basis of performance and efficiency alone, and I think often neglects to consider issues of form and of program. And so we picked ecologically minded designers for this chapter who were interested in, first and foremost, unleashing the creative potential of sustainability, employing green principles at different scales, from buildings to master plans, to address important issues like water retention and terrain remediation, energy. But whether they're large or small, all of them we chose because we believe they push the parameters of sustainability beyond these familiar checklists, raising both environmental and design standards. So a few Groundwork projects employ, you've seen this before, living walls and green roofs. We were particularly interested in projects that sort of made them sort of strange, like this one. This project is, I'll mispronounce their Dutch firm, Vinohoven CS, and we thought that this kind of weird sports center, again, is interesting the way it both merges but sort of stands out as this kind of creepy, furry creature in the center of Amsterdam. Another take on green walls is this project by Howler and Yoon. I saw they were on your lecture series, and Young Architects in Boston. It's a tower of stacked incubators that transformed this abandoned lot in downtown Boston into a kind of surreal vertical farm that they argue can cultivate microalgae, which is a renewable biofuel. And these prefabricated modules, as you can see, can be sort of trained, assembled, disassembled, and redistributed to almost any site. And again, we embraced this project because it was once a kind of vertical urban billboard to scientific progress, visually arresting, and basically raising environmental awareness and literally growing the biofuel economy. Another take on green walls. Many of you know this project. He was also, I think, I saw in your lecture series, Francois Roche. Again, maybe you know this, a kind of small cabana installed in the courtyard of a kind of bourgeois Parisian apartment block that is literally kind of shrouded or concealed, covered with 1,200 hydroponic ferns. And the ferns are fed by this constellation of these sort of strange blown glass vases that contain rhizobia, which is a kind of bacterial soup that provides nitrogen to the ferns without the assistance of soil. And Roche talks about how the kind of project's kind of creepy bacterial feeding system unnerved the neighbors who thought it would contaminate their children. And so again, we were kind of interested in projects like these that where nature is rendered not as benign, but sometimes as sort of strange, as even ominous, perhaps injecting a critical edge into the prevailing feel-good sensibility of a lot of green design. Another project in the ecology section is this one, another project by Snowhetta that deals with this issue of recycling. But here again, we were interested in the way in this abstract circular form inscribed in this very remote landscape, clearly influenced by land artists like Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, Broken Circle, another project by him. And in this case, this is a kind of tourist route that literally recycles sort of local driftwood from a nearby beach and local stones, even incorporating the fragment of a ruined radar station. And lastly, another project, a much bigger scale, which tries to remediate this kind of contaminated area in Santander, Spain, again using a kind of abstract sort of vocabulary to create this kind of urban park. The last chapter is biocomputation. And here, as you know, since antiquity, architects and designers have dreamed of deriving a kind of immutable form of language from the universal laws of nature. And from Leonardo da Vinci to Le Corbusier, his modular, from Buckminster Fuller to Frei Otto, all of these architects searched for a vocabulary which they believed would be based on the timeless and in particular geometric forms and proportions that they believed infused all of creation. But currently, there's a new generation of younger digital designers who are likewise interested in aligning biology and design to tap into the geometric principles which they also believe underlie and govern living things. But I think what's important here is that they subscribe to a very different conception of nature than their forebears, not the kind of top-down, kind of ordered cosmos of the modernist, but instead digital designers script codes that exploit the computer's potential to emulate living systems by using algorithms that they believe reflect the kind of diversity and complexity of biological processes. They generate forms and patterns that they argue match a conception of nature that's adaptive, self-organizing, and without external control. And so Aranda Lash, a project in the book, this is an interpretation of the ancient grotto, and I think it exemplifies this strategy of rethinking geometry here via a computational sequence. 4 polygonal modules depicted here are assembled in a non-repetitive structure that, although it appears random, possesses a very precise geometrical and structural organization. Another project, other biocomputation architects like Ecological Studio out of England use programs to generate, again, ecologically responsible groundscapes, very much like what we saw in other chapters of the book. But I think, again, what distinguishes them is, again, this notion that parametrics allows them to design performative environments that are ideally suited to tackling environmental issues. Why? Because, again, they have the capacity to adapt and to reflect to nuances of context and of climate over time. So in this example, the architects argue that not only is this house using local sort of timber and materials, but its form and its structure was literally devised to kind of, by considering kind of wind and solar and climatic forces that produced this design. A different approach, this is the Oceanic Pavilion in Korea by Tom Wiscombe. He again proposes a parametrically designed building. It's a kind of aquarium, and not a kind of aquarium, it is an aquarium. And the exterior shell, he argues, not only looks like, but actually replicates the behavior of the sea creatures that it exhibits. And without getting into much detail, Wiscombe argues that inspired by the morphology of sea life, it consists of a soft transparent membrane reinforced by stiff capillaries of compressed air threaded across its surface, and then each of the soft membranes is then encased or held within a fiber composite shell, and there are these sort of micro veinings that again create structural and ornamental continuity. And another project in biocomputation is Dune by young architects Magnus Lawson. In this case, the attempt is to reverse desertification of the Sahara. In this case, they are recommending a 6,000-kilometer beltway of crystallized sand dunes that are constructed a little bit like Francois Roche, using a non-pathogenic microorganism, a bacillus, that they claim can turn sand into sandstone. And this bacillus is deployed on the surface of large balloons whose biomorphic forms were derived from scripting technologies that were themselves inspired by these very particular Topography rock formations. And they function as positive-negative molds that, when placed next to the shifting sand dunes, harden over a 24-hour period, transforming the desert into this fabulous network of inhabitable interiors. And lastly, or last but not least, the project includes a project by a Berkeley professor, Nicholas de Monchaux, a colleague who's in the audience here today. And Nicholas bridges two groundwork categories, ecology and biocomputation. He uses geospatial analysis in his project Local Code to identify thousands of publicly owned abandoned sites in major American cities, including San Francisco. Is that correct? Yeah? And what Nicholas should come up and talk about his project, but in the interest of time, I'll try. So he imagines that these vacant landscapes, again, identified through computational analysis, can form a kind of new network, a robust network of urban greenways. And parametric design enables Monchaux to tailor a landscape proposal for each of the sites that he discovers, and again, through biocomputational analysis, to analyze local site conditions, to optimize thermal and hydrological performance, to enhance the ecology of the site, but the city as a whole, not only creating these wonderful parks, but also basically relieving the burden of the existing urban infrastructure. So that's a kind of sums up a kind of just a smattering, a teaser of the projects in the book. And I'm just going to end by showing you a few of my own projects. My interest in groundwork stems directly from my own teaching and practice. Over the past 8 years, since meeting Diana Belmori, landscape architect, a colleague of mine at Yale, we began to work and teach together. And the kind of this interest in transgressing these boundaries really sort of derives out of her own work. And working at different scales, we call our approach interface. We're particularly interested in exploring the kind of seam, the scale where inside and outside, natural and synthetic building and landscape meet. And I'm going to just show you a few examples of 5 projects. They range from a private house to a public park that shows how we're thinking of this interface design approach to work at different scales. And the first project I'll talk about, actually, I began working on sort of before this collaboration, but it is a project that's interested in landscape, in this case framing landscape. It's a house located on Mount Merino, which is about 2.5 hours north of New York City. And it was sort of the, not sort of, but it was the place where the home to the great 19th century American landscape painters, of wilderness painters. And it has these commanding views of the Hudson River. And the project is composed of these two elements, a kind of cedar-clad wall, which encases private spaces, and a kind of public concrete ribbon, which encases the public spaces and kind of snakes down the hill. But the point here is that the house was designed to capture a series of panoramic views of the Catskill Mountains, views that were depicted by Hudson River painters like Frederick Church, whose house depicted here, Olana, is located about a half a mile down the road from this house. And if Church's landscape depictions were painted on canvas using a kind of static picture frame, our project deploys this sort of spiral ramp to, we hope, create a dynamic series of sort of snapshots of the landscape, a series of cinematic views. And here's the floor plan. You kind of park your car, enter up the staircase, come into this kind of large space overlooking the site, out to this southern overhang, and you can spiral down the hillside. Here's some view. Here's a view of the front of the house, the kind of stair that over here that leads you up. And at the top, visitors enter the house through a kind of glass foyer and pass this two-story light well. And they enter into this large room that's enclosed by a butterfly roof, a kind of single interior that combines the living dining area with the master bedroom in the distance. And in this view, you can see the kind of anchor of the house is a kind of chimney, and you can go down the staircase and descend into a den, or you could enter out onto that veranda and kind of enjoy that Hudson River view. You come out onto this porch that faces west, but are led south, and this overhanging southern canopy is again to kind of protect but make possible kind of life by the pool towards the south. And you can see here's this pool terrace. The spiral ramp then leads you down to a kind of lower level. Here you can see it in the plan, and ultimately takes you past this den that's illuminated by this light court. And ultimately, the ramp terminates in a covered dining porch and in a jacuzzi. And finally, resting at the bottom of the ramp, the viewer's ultimate encounter with the landscape is, again, this framed static view that was designed to literally evoke the Hudson River view that Church painted, depicted here, which was the source of inspiration for the project. And here's just a view of the house up the hill. The next project is the first collaboration that I engaged in with Diana Belmore. A while ago now, New York City had a really good chance of winning the 2012 Olympic Games. Ultimately, George Bush blew it and London got it. But at that time, there was a commission set up, and Diana and I were invited to design an equestrian facility in this park, La Tourette Park, which is in Staten Island. And the idea was to kind of remediate this contaminated site. It's actually next to Freshkills landfill, which is here, right there. Okay, that's where all the sort of garbage and debris of New York is. A lot of it is placed, including the remains of the World Trade Center. So the idea was to create a kind of venue for the Olympics, but ultimately leave behind an environmentally progressive park for future generations of New Yorkers. And our approach was, rather than adhere to the convention of this kind of big stadium, that sits on the land, we wanted to kind of treat the stadium as an earthwork. It's composed of these two elements diagrammed here. We called it the ribbon and the berm. And you can see that the berm is a S-shaped earth mound. It defines two exterior spaces, both dedicated to spectatorship, a demountable outdoor amphitheater for $35,000, and an overlook that offers visitors a behind-the-scenes look at the practice fields. So again, here's that stadium, the mound, and here's that overlook to the practice fields. And in this view, stadiums, the visitors can ascend one of these 3 earth berms to engage the concourse level, upon which are placed these bleachers, which, it's a long story, but value engineering, we originally wanted the whole thing to be sort of buried in the earth. We couldn't do that, and so we had to work with these bleachers. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but here it shows how at the end of the stadium, there's a kind of what we're calling the ribbon, which encloses and wraps the bleachers, then forms a bridge that leads to the overlook of the practice fields. And then, but the kind of, here's the real kind of point of the project was, again, as I said, value engineering prevented us from pursuing our original idea. So we learned when we met with bleacher manufacturers that they typically sort of shroud the bleachers in a kind of printed decorative scrim. And so our solution was to transfer this sort of logic of the printed scrim onto the landscape, to print the landscape literally with this pattern of abstract dots that is wrapping the temporary bleachers, but becomes 3-dimensional as it literally emerges and becomes these sort of planted dots scattered across the landscape. And in this animation, it was an attempt to show how the sort of dots would sort of blossom for the Olympics. They would last for the kind of 6 or 8 weeks of the games, I think 6, and then ultimately they would sort of blend and merge back into the landscape. Great. Okay. This project, a very different scale, also a collaboration with Belmori Associates, is a loft, a 3,000 square foot loft in Manhattan. It's for a developer who asked us to link vertically his loft with a kind of roof terrace that offered panoramic views of downtown Manhattan. But very specifically, he said he wanted a design that would reflect his company's commitment to sustainable design. And so this project employs a carefully researched selection of materials and systems that are listed here. Without, again, diminishing their importance, what we wanted to do was sort of push green design beyond this familiar checklist of LEED certified materials, and we attempted to create a design that impacted lifestyle, that began to rethink the nature of a kind of urban garden. And so here our challenge was to do what many California modernists do, linking inside and outside, but we didn't have a kind of big glass glazed wall in which to do that. So what we tried to do, as this diagram expresses, is to reverse the convention of modernism of the hard materials going outside and to really move exterior to interior. The stair bulkhead depicted in this diagram behaves as a kind of a core, a transitional element that facilitates material continuity, allowing the outdoor cladding and vegetation to literally flow into the very heart of the loft, where it forms an interior green core that separates the public from the private space. And here's a picture of that green core segregating the master bedroom. And when privacy is desired, our client can press a button and there's some sort of screens that allow him to close off his space. And our client asked us, he said he wanted to bathe surrounded by nature. Building codes disallowed us from actually making this a literally open atrium. It's covered by glass. But again, what we did do is that this shot is taken on axis from the front entry, and it sort of terminates, as you can see, in this sort of green wall in the distance, which is the shower. And if the client wants privacy, he can switch on and off this sort of translucent privacy glass. And this image just shows the rear of the bathroom clad in these modular panels, surmounted by, again, a skylight, again, trying to encourage that kind of vertical continuity between above and below. This is, again, the section showing this living wall and the kind of south-facing bulkhead that segregates public and private space. And a view of this sort of stair, right, that leads to the roof. And here a suspended roof deck, again planted by Belmori with sedum and grasses that are designed both to absorb heat energy and but also form a kind of outdoor room that our client can enjoy. And ultimately, we planted this bulkhead that forms a kind of perch, a little house on the prairie in New York City to enjoy the southern view. The next project is designed, is in South Korea. It's an enclave of 12 homes, and we won it with a large firm, Han Associates, out of Seoul, Korea. And it's a project for 12 what are referred to as sort of townhouses. And here again, the project was about deploying with a developer. It was a hard sell, green roofs, again, whose solar orientation, you know, has all kinds of sort of ecological benefits. But for us, we were interested in the green roofs as a device that allowed us to integrate the housing complex within this site. And the project was designed to take advantage of its sloping site by updating the Asian principle of the borrowed view. And this is a technique that was employed by 18th century, actually European and Asian gardeners. It was a device to compose landscape that merged natural features in the distance with the private garden in the foreground. And so these diagrams attempt to demonstrate this idea. In our 21st century version of this concept, the adjoining houses are visually arranged. They're staggered so that a neighbor can visually share the private green space of their neighbor's roof without sacrificing domestic privacy. And this arrangement allows each unit unobstructed views by framing the kind of green roof in the foreground with a kind of distant view of the landscape beyond. And the green roofs were not only we hope could not only be enjoyed by homeowners, but also by the general public, who could view them from this park, as you can see, across this valley. Actually, those of you who've been to Seoul, it's a very, very built-up urban metropolis, very few open spaces, and this little bit of green was left open only because the president's house, the Blue House, is located kind of at the other end of this park. But again, the idea is that visitors in the park could look back at our project, taking advantage of Korea's 4 distinct seasons, a little bit like New York. Each roof is again planted with these undulating stripes of local sedum and plants that change hues and allow its tones to kind of blend into the surrounding landscape. This is a view of the massing of the kind of private street that leads to the homes. It was designed to evoke qualities associated with Seoul's now endangered, almost vanishing traditional urban fabric, which is, you know, absolutely built and very, very characterized by these blank walls and kind of hovering roofs. It's all about privacy from the street, and we wanted to contrast this with a kind of openness towards the view. Again, adopting another tradition Korean typology, a central courtyard referred to as the hanuk that offers traditionally kind of indoor-outdoor living, and the traditional Korean house here borrowed and adapted to this project. The ground level spaces enjoy this kind of indoor outdoor arrangement, as well as the upper level bedrooms, again, all share this sort of planted courtyard. So the last project that I will share with you is a project currently on the boards at our office. We were one of, well, originally 8 international firms that included Dillo Scofidio, Renfro, Lotec, Jürgen Meyer. Now there a few others have joined. And we were invited by a California developer to participate in the design of a senior community in Palm Springs geared to an underserved demographic. In this case, lesbian, gay, and bisexual, transgendered seniors. And this is the master plan, and ours, obviously, is in color, is on the lower left, is our sector. And we designed the project in conjunction with Jeff excuse me, Jeff DiGirolamo, I screwed up his name, but of Surface Design. He's in the audience, San Francisco-based firm, and it's been a wonderful collaboration. And Jeff is doing the master plan landscape for the entire project and also working with us on our sector. And our sector is organized around what we call the Commons. It's a landscaped meeting ground that can be shared by residents who live in one of the two housing types depicted here. These are the pool homes, these are the garden homes. But what I'm especially proud of about the project is something that seems relatively minor, was the fact that our client allowed us to place this, which is the assisted living facility, basically the nursing home where basically people go to die. And I think what's interesting, and this diagram attempts to show it, this is a kind of typical plan, which interestingly enough, at least to me, uses landscape and roads to literally camouflage and segregate the assisted living facility from independent living. There's a kind of shame associated with that. So instead, the assisted living facility is literally the kind of very, very hub of the project and of the community. And as you can see in this rendering, we try to use the landscape, indigenous landscape, to both kind of strike a balance between a desire for continuity and publicity, but also privacy. And we did that, we try to do that using landscape. So as you can see, there's this continuous ADA ramp that leads to the assisted living facility where community programs are housed. There are these kind of sunken courtyards that give a degree of privacy, but also continuity through bridges to the commons. And there's this continuous lap pool that again forms a kind of natural fence that both links but also separates these pool homes from the complex. And again, this is just kind of zooming in at the two housing types. The first garden home, they're kind of rammed earth party walls that are pierced and covered by a solar canopy made of perforated metal that provides each house with a sort of shaded roof terrace. And this is showing the kind of end of the complex has this sort of canopy that's a kind of welcome awning into our sector of the commons. And again, the idea of the project was that there's not one but many sort of gay identities, many gay lifestyles, and so we wanted the housing types to kind of appeal to many of them, those who crave community and those who cherish their solitude. And so at the beginning, don't ask me why, I sort of got very kind of influenced by these sort of two kind of popular culture gay icons. The first, Golden Girls. I might offend some people in the audience, but many of us believe that these are really a bunch of gay men living together. And sort of the kind of paradigm of la cage aux folles, of married with children. So in the first house, these are the plans. Communal domestic life for the roommates or for the family takes place on this first floor living level, kind of organized around the kitchen. And there's a kind of bridge connection here that leads to the commons. But if you desire privacy, you can go downstairs. And each of the units are organized around their own sort of almost like a private hotel suite with their own outdoor public space. And this is a kind of section, again, showing how we try to integrate landscape into the project, but also manipulate the sections so that there's this possibility of publicity and privacy without the kind of recourse to traditional isolated fences. And this is the pool home on the eastern edge of the property. And as you can see, there's this lap pool that runs the entire length of the project that allows swimmers to kind of enjoy these expansive views of the mountains in the distance, planted again by Jeff with kind of local indigenous planting. Also, Jeff is very interested in water management. That was very important to this design. But for us, being much more superficial than Jeff, I was very kind of inspired by this movie, The Swimmer. Some of you know it. It's this 1967 film. It features a kind of Speedo-clad Burt Lancaster, and he basically engages his neighbors by literally swimming from one backyard to the other and sort of basically having affairs and with his neighbors. So the inspiration was that the lap pool in our project could also act as a kind of vehicle that fosters community interaction by erasing fences that typically isolate domestic spaces. Again, these are the floor plans. There's a carport. It leads directly into the heart of the house, again, organized around the kitchen. As you can see, there's a kind of indoor-outdoor device of trying to weave the soft textures of landscape literally into the house, rhyming through carpeting. Again, when you want privacy, you go upstairs, and again, these 4 rooms, self-contained suites with kind of direct views to the mountains in the distance. Again, and here's this kind of haha-like section of the, haha meaning derived from 18th century, forget it. Anyway, there's this sort of sluice gate that opens and closes, so if you want your friends to kind of swim into your house, you can, or else you can keep them out. A view of that kind of indoor-outdoor kind of rhyming of the soft textures of the interior with the kind of organic materials on the exterior. And finally, running the length of the commons is this lap pool, again, surmounted by assisted living. The kind of design, again, was actually inspired by my grandmother. I come from a very dysfunctional family, but she was the one person, without getting into too much detail, that I truly loved and loved me. And she died at 106. And she lived in Miami Beach, and she used to take my arm and sort of take me to all the hotel lobbies and introduce me to her friends. She thrived on the kind of transformation of South Beach, and then when she tripped and fell, they put her into an assisted living facility, and within a matter of months, she died. So I think that inspiration was, again, this is where my grandmother would have wanted to live, in the center of the action, by the disco, you know, and by the pool, and so that's kind of what we were lucky enough to allow our client to allow us to do. Okay, so again, I hope these 5 projects from my office, I hope, you know, they show how, to some extent, although I have clients with limitations, I try to practice what I preach. But more important, I hope that this overview of my book, our book, Groundwork, has whetted your appetite to maybe get a copy of the book. But more important, I hope that this talk this evening, I hope that I've managed at least to clearly express its message, this message of an appeal for a new form of cross-disciplinary practice. And we know that the modernist paradigm of the heroic architect of Howard Rourke as a single disciplinary leader is hopelessly outmoded given the complex environmental and social issues posed by our interconnected global world. Now is the moment for landscape and architecture, but not only landscape and architecture, but for natural science and ecology, for engineering and biocomputation, and for other disciplines to come together around a table and to seek a new formal vocabulary which would be derived from the union of the human and the non-human, the natural and the synthetic. Groundwork champions this new breed of cross-disciplinary pioneer who recognizes the importance of combining technological, formal, and programmatic innovation, why with the objective of leading to the creation of high-performance environments suited to 21st century life. Thank you very much. That deal with issues of kind of
landscape and disability. It seems like another angle of landscape and identity.
No, that could be a whole book that Nicholas should do. We should write on this. No, but no, it's not something that. But thanks for appreciating that aspect of it. Anybody questions? Yeah.
I'm just going to you spoke a little bit about this at the event in New York, about the kind of ramifications in the book for education. I know this school is doing some really interesting things with integrating landscape into its curriculum. You were at Berkeley with us 2 years ago, where there's this kind of historic notion that the discipline should collaborate that doesn't exist in the institutionality of the school. It would be great, I think, especially for this kind of audience, to hear you figure out what it means at the beginning as well as the end.
Well, Actually, I think you're better qualified to answer that question than me. But Nicholas is referring to we did an event at Cooper Union.
We cannot hear.
I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Nicholas is referring to an event at Cooper Union in New York City that he was generous enough to fly on his own dime. I say publicly. Oh, Berkeley's dime. Okay, yeah. Then I'm not so appreciative. Anyway, but there was a panel discussion with different representatives of the book, including Nicholas and Tony Vidler moderated, and there was a discussion that was engendered about this topic that you raised about forging a kind of cross-disciplinary education, and different people had different opinions to that, and I would just chime in, which is to say that we kind of advocate that not so much to eradicate sort of the design professions, because I think there is an expertise that sort of, let's say, differentiates a landscape architect from an architect and an ecologist from an engineer. But again, the point being, I made the point before, that you want to kind of have a very inclusive table where you set, around that table different experts, all with a kind of overlapping interest. And I think most importantly, that landscape and thinking about site and the integration of materials and space and program, indoors and outdoors, shouldn't be an afterthought, but should be sort of occur at the very beginning of the design process. And so at Yale, where I teach, where we don't have a landscape school, Diane and I teach what we call interface studios, which is the only opportunity in our curriculum where a student can be sort of offered this challenge, which proves to be difficult. But I know, do you have feelings about that?
Yeah, we're starting in our post-professional and interdisciplinary program with the design of landscape. And I should say architecture design of landscape. I think it's something that is always a question, not just sort of in the relationship between landscape and architecture, but also with the other disciplines. It's the T issue, how deep you enable students in discipline to get expertise, and at the same time have the ability to come to the table as a specialist and collaborate with others on projects. And I think we do a lot more of that at the upper levels in the curriculum. In advanced studios, many of them operate collaboratively, many of them deal with different disciplines.
Take on it.
It's so interesting, the college just turned 50, and the College of Environmental Design brought landscape out of the College of Natural Resources, and together with architecture, which had been spawned in engineering, with the notion under Worcester's guidance, with the notion that the building was designed ostensibly as a kind of functional diagram of that collaboration. The building itself actually militates very strongly against collaboration in the way that it actually transpired, and then a kind of a generation of professional kind of jealousies also, I think, really severely hobbled the collaboration. This notion, I mean, we dealt with it much more at UVA, where we merged the departments and then had to issue a divorce, where there is this question of which really reflects what's going on in the profession, is that when you talk to a landscape architect about collaboration, what they're really hearing from an architect, I can do what you do. And when you talk to an architect, it's this notion of and I think the book actually provides really strong models for projects that kind of problematize in a great way these very conventional ways of dealing with each other's disciplines.
And it's a challenge. I mean, Jeff, I wonder if you were trained as an architect.
I was trained as an architect, but what I was interested in asking about was, did you study models outside of the U.S.? Did you introduce the lecture as a U.S. journey into the West and the landscape? And I don't find the relationship between architects and landscape architects in other countries as aggressive as they are in this country. And that seems entirely rooted in the way you introduce the lecture. And it's simply American attitude about landscape. But I don't know that it necessarily extends to European practice, and which will vary country by country or even practice in Asia. And it would be interesting to kind of explore those models as both models for professional practice, but also for education.
I think that, go on, sorry.
Yeah, which is just, I mean, it's a really easy model. I'll go to Europe and China and do that.
No, but I think you raised an incredibly important point. And now, as you raise the point, it's a contradiction in the book, because the book is international global practices, not just America. But my essay in this talk, as you rightly said, just focuses on America. And that's just a kind of function of, like, you know, in my limited spare time, I sort of transgressed and tried to, actually Nicholas gave me some help, sort of tried to do my own kind of reading of a discourse I didn't know, and I thought I would just sort of stick to the kind of American paradigm. And the reason why I became interested in the question, again, had to do with the kind of frustrations of actually collaborating with Diana and beginning to try to kind of understand why this opposition, but I would say it's, I think, a peculiarly American thing, but I think it exists, I mean, in Europe, but I think one of the major differences is that because almost every square inch, let's say, of England or France is cultivated, I think that kind of ethos of the kind of untainted wilderness, I think that is a particularly American thing, and I think it's still something, I mean, think of like movies like Avatar, or even Brokeback Mountain, that I think still, in many ways, like in the guise of progressive environmentalism, still kind of endorse this kind of way of thinking. But I think you rightly point out that it's a very particular American standpoint, and it needs to be seen in a broader way.
You showed an image of the Symbiotically building in Finland. That's probably one of the more recent, really great examples of collaborations with landscape architects, public planners, and architects, resulting in really great design. And it was I mean, that's, to me, it's a model about architects and landscape architects.
So just building on that topic, it seems like within the groundwork focus, it's trying to advance something very different than landscape urbanism in terms of like architecture, landscape, and then where the city falls into all this. So if you could clarify that, I mean, if you don't mind, if you could.
That's a very good question and a difficult question. I mean, what's the relationship of what we're doing to landscape urbanism?
Yeah, and where's the city?
Yeah.
I mean, where do you see the...
Well, I'm actually a little bit terrified of that question, because a week from today, well, we're giving this lecture at Harvard next week with Charles Waldheim, so we're going to get fried. But I would,
you can practice.
Yeah. So my answer would be, okay, yeah, no, that what Charles is doing is unbelievable and important. And I wouldn't diminish its importance, but I kind of inferred a little bit before that I think in many ways Charles comes out of Charles Waldheim, but also people like James Corner, come out of this McCarthyan tradition, which I still think is, again, interest in that sort of macro scale and a kind of process design orientation, which I think process is important. But what I'm a little bit critical of is again, of this kind of architecture without authorship, this kind of dream that somehow if you kind of follow the kind of ostensibly objective logic of certain kinds of scientific or ecological processes, that you can somehow evade the responsibility of design. But I think most specifically, I think Dan and I are sort of interested in another scale, which is maybe that more material embodied scale where inside and outside kind of begin to align and to begin to talk to each other. So I don't know if that's a good enough answer, but I think the landscape urbanism tends to be a much more macro way of thinking, and we're kind of talking about getting a little more micro.
Yeah, I have a question that follows up. So I understand the differentiation between scales, and I would also agree with you that the landscape urbanism approach is more dedicated to large-scale projects. But when you have a look at what emerged out of landscape urbanism, it is a new understanding that you have to incorporate processes and performance when it comes to urban transformations. And we learned this from nature, and this is also why it was driven by landscape architects. So my question in relationship to the groundwork is, how is this set of work very different from works at least from maybe 10 or 15 years ago, where nature was a source of form-finding processes? So this part of integrating performance, something an intelligence that you can learn from nature, and that actually changes our attitude of what architecture is doing. Because I'm still looking for this moment in our professional dialogues where we understand, no, it's not our job to abuse nature. And even adapting formal spatial strategies, for me, is a kind of abuse. It comes back to your first opening, where you said it's the male and the female gender role, and nature is there to be taken over. And I still wait for this moment where we learn something from nature and understand this is something that we have to learn from nature rather than vice versa. So I was looking for this new approach. In landscape urbanism, it happened, that we adapted the terminologies of process and performance, for example. And I think architecture has a big opportunity to do this as well. But some of the projects, and I'm just sitting at Sarah did, for me it's completely formal what's happening. And it has nothing to do with what you can learn from nature.
I think it's more of a comment that's sort of brilliant, and I think gets into some of the kind of conundrums and discussions that Diana and I had. Because on the one hand, one could be a naysayer and dismiss some of these projects as purely formal, but this is an aside, but Ala, you could probably relate to this, and you too as an editor. Yeah, there's like a, yeah. No, but there's a moment when when it's really fun to edit a book because you become a champion of other people's work, and architects are so bitchy to each other. You know, so it's a lot. It is about giving benefit of the doubt. But even in a case like a Zaha project, which you could dismiss as being formal, we were still championing the fact that it was a conception that was calling into question the kind of object building that was disengaged from the landscape, and we were very interested in the way formally and materially and programmatically she was aligning those distinctions of organic and natural. But Diana, in particular, would agree with you. She is most partial, as we developed the book, to the last section, biocomputation, which is precisely that, which she would argue, too, and does in her essay, that again, what's different now is a completely different conception of nature as something that's sort of active and unstable and sort of bottom up, and that it's actually the possibility through the computer and biocomputation that we really could get to a place where we're not just going to mimic what nature looks like as we did in the old days, but actually produce this sort of, again, process-driven, performative environment that I think you're alluding to. But again, we were just trying to kind of open it up and be a little bit more inclusive than that. Yeah.
And form, I think it was building within this beyond the process, the idea that as architects, and also interestingly within architectural education, we are always privileging form material because we actually don't build within the institution, and this becomes another thing. The notion of materiality being subservient to the form or filling out form. The old biomorphic model still exists, and I think that's one, that has to be questioned within this trajectory, because I think it's a very different understanding, let's say, from a landscape architect that thinks of material as being living, growing, and transforming, and that it's not just a question of process, but what that means for materiality. Architects, we don't often think that way, even though buildings do have lives. As cities do, and often where they fail happens within that kind of material processing. So I think it's another sort of extended discourse, but I think it's critical for this question of landscape. David, you had
I think that, if you look at the whole landscape urbanism school, it's all very post-McCartneyan, and there's nothing revolutionary about saying that, we need to move beyond the man-nature divide. And the difficulty I have, in a sense, is that there is no discussion really about Horner and Stoss and even Michael van Valkenburg and Loyola, for God's sake, whose people are really transform their practices and become much more about process, stormwater, and ecology, and public space, and really synthetic projects in many ways. And then I see your work, and it's really fantastic, but also even, you're calling for a new synthetic practice, but Diane Balmari's, even Jeff's contribution to the projects are like planting. and it further reinforces that sort of divide. I don't really, my conversations and collaborations with architects these days are not really limited to that. They're very much about diagramming the process and programming context and form and everything. And I disagree that landscape urbanism is limited to this sort of bar scale that is totally bottom up. If you read some of the more recent writings from perhaps Waldheim Corner, Terra Fluxus is one of them. It talks very much about having, the bird song being as important as the Beastie Boys and NutraSweet being as important as nectar. These ideas of culture and expression, he in a sense makes a correction to that. And you see that actually in projects now. So it's a bit of
I wasn't suggesting that landscape urbanists adopted this kind of top-down approach. I think it is very much about recognizing the kind of complexities that you're talking about. The only thing I would just sort of add to that in terms of my own collaborations with Bill Morey, perhaps I misstated them, but all of the projects that we work on together, from schematics, we're working on the projects together. It's not a question of introducing planting, although in the end of the day, I don't know anything about planting, and that is one rule that Diana takes. So I hope I didn't misspeak. Yeah.
In collaborating with you, Joel, I'm always finding incredibly receptive. Albeit stubborn and egotistical and big-headed sometimes. My collaboration with you was really great because you were open as well as all the other architects and thrilled to. We integrated like the incredible and subtle stormwater management system into that plan, which is unheard of in Palm Springs. And I think it was because we were able to talk about formal elements of design, which don't exist all the time in my profession. Some are coming from being apart. And there isn't that way to talk and draw and do things that architects do with pen and paper. And for landscape profession all the time, a lot of the time there is, but there is, at least in my practice, an appreciation of formalism in integrating these structures of various talking about into a formal vocabulary that collaborates with them.
Last question.
So many questions. Yeah.
Jill, I was really interesting thing that emerges from the lecture is that in three categories you're really talking about this idea of constructing landscape. And it's just three different perhaps scales and different ways of seeing. But I was really interested in, since you start with you posit the problem as a completely American problem in terms of the attitude towards wilderness. How does that, where does culture enter this whole so how in terms of the historical conception and cultural conception of landscape as it changes throughout the globe, how do you see that? Is there anywhere in the book or in the work where there's
I'm not sure about culture, because I think the premise, which is not my premise, but other people, let's say, who sort of deconstructed the nature-culture opposition in the critique of wilderness, would argue that wilderness itself is a conception, or nature itself is a cultural construction that changes historically, and that wilderness is sort of one version of that. And that it's important to understand how culturally that conception and nature stuff
I meant it more like how does the report to landscape? How does culture or the fact when you look at examples from examples from France and also architects practicing in a context that is different from their own and many others. How does a cultural conception or the cultural relationship to a landscape, when it's different from the American paradigm, how does it then influence it?
Oh, no, okay. You were saying that. I think that the book is primarily a kind of, for the most part, sort of European and sort of, I guess, North American. But clearly, like for example, the practice when we've been doing a few projects in Korea, and maybe also Jeff could speak to that. I mean, I think what was kind of interesting that we actually had a fight with our client as Americans to kind of argue for trying to incorporate conceptions which we as outsiders were reading through a kind of alternative view of what landscape was. In other words, that there was a kind of drive to hire us perhaps because of this maybe more sort of international notion of this potential opposition between nature and culture. But I guess, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I would say, yes, I think that we need to find a balance between, let's say, the local and the global, and that I think that as we work regionally, we have to think about regional conceptions of nature as well as regional conditions. But I think at the same time, I think we are increasingly operating in a kind of global world where I think a lot of these ideas are everywhere, for better or for worse.
Related to landscape, and I would argue that, you know, this changes dramatically from culture to culture, and so I was just wondering whether there's anywhere, when you decided to include examples from outside of the international context, that there's any way that that is realized.
Because I think we have three last quick questions or comments. Yeah.
I just want to say I find your work really inspiring. As a student here at CCA, look forward to applying some of your methodologies my next few years here. Just a quick question. You talk about landscape and design, but there's this idea that it can also be like easily commercialized. So like say like brands like now McDonald's are stamping green roofs on their buildings just to justify an image for the brand. What's your stand on that? And do you think this merges the paradigm of like successful landscape design?
You're asking about the phenomenon of.
Well, I mean, do you think this is the right step for commercialization of
green and landscape design for companies like McDonald's, or in general, the commercialization of green landscape? Do you think this is the right step for merging these ideas?
I mean, I think the question is kind of critique, and I think at the one point you could sort of dismiss these efforts as just a kind of ploy of international capitalism to sort of promote their wares using the latest fashionable ism, and I'm sure there's somewhat of that, but I think that at least it's a positive sort of step forward, maybe a trickle-down effect that a kind of, you know, environmental consciousness has, you know, sort of penetrated popular culture and has, you know, affected mass culture, even mass advertising. But I'm sure other people in this audience will have more sophisticated kind of responses to that.
In some ways, the project at the end, the LGBT Senior Center, in a way is a more radical construct societally than, let's say, particular ideas about landscape. I'm just wondering, which I know is mostly coming from a client, you know, is kind of orchestrating a project like that. But I'm just wondering whether you approached it differently than you would if it, what did you do differently there by virtue of who that project is meant to address than you might for, let's say, other constituencies?
Just back up. You said that you thought that that was more.
Is a radical project, I think. Yeah.
But why then?
What's that?
Why?
Why? Because it's got the potential to. It's got the potential to suggest that there's a different spatial model for how a non-heterosexual society might organize itself.
But I'm not sure I'm answering your question. But, okay. For me, that project was an interesting one because it enabled me to, let's say, look at two, one long-standing interest, which is this interest in gender and architecture, and the second one, which had to do with landscape. And so I feel that what we tried to do there, and again, I don't think the form, is radical. There were a lot of constraints. The client wanted sort of houses. But what we try to do was use landscape as a device to kind of, make possible other forms of domesticity. And so for me, that's where I think the project became an interesting, where those two come together. But I'm not sure this was your question, but for me, I felt that, or I'll start again, there was a lot of discussion amongst the people, the other people who participated in it about, what constituted sort of a gay community. And I think for some of us, including myself, I'd like to think that this project would be of interest for anybody to live there, and that it just maybe took, let's say, a kind of queer perspective to kind of offer maybe a slightly different version of what a community was. So that's
Marcia, you're the last one, and we'll try to wrap this
now,
up
this
so
is
people can have.
staying in San Francisco. This is not what it is, but yeah.
Some of the examples, even most of the examples, I think the living space and landscape is still somewhat separate. And is it an aim to bring them together, or if you do, you go back to like prehistoric living conditions?
Caves. It's all about caves.
But I think one of the potential problems of this lecture and this book is to sort of advocate, as you said, that we all need to sort of go back to nature or live in this organic, natural way. I think all the book is trying to advocate is just a way of thinking, a way of designing that begins to think about the inside and the outside and the inhabitation and its site in a cohesive manner. It can result in forms that in the end of Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it could produce projects that are, let's say, blended as, let's say, the Zaha project, but it could also produce projects maybe like the Snow Hedda project or some of the other projects that at first glance are more like a traditional object building that's differentiated from the ground. In other words, I don't think that a groundwork project necessarily has to seamlessly kind of blend organic and synthetic. I think it's one of the formal strategies that is a device by which to at least problematize these distinctions and ask people to think about humans and nature in a different way.
I'm gonna cut it off here, and otherwise we'll start to dwindle down.
Yes.
It'll be a small conversation. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.